This is Kelly Hill, technology reporter for RCR Wireless News. I'm here today with Emil Olbrich of Primelime, and we are at the 5G Innovation Summit. We just finished up a panel. Emil, what have you seen over the last couple of days that you thought were sort of the highlights of the event?
It's really interesting to see all the interest in 5G, first off, and from a lot of different areas, from device manufacturers and from infrastructure manufacturers. But I think the key takeaways, I would say, are there's a lot of interest in why isn't the standard completed, and people want to get moving now on that. So I think understanding some of the standardization efforts that are going on and that things aren't necessarily solid. And I think the other key takeaway was the difference between what the carriers are doing right now in their network, specifically Verizon and KT, and how that differs from what 3GPP's approach is pretty interesting, and that they're continuing to move down that path regardless of what 3GPP says. So.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, what do you see as some of the challenges? We just ended up having, I think, a good conversation about some of the design and test challenges that are ahead for 5G. Working with millimeter wave, poses a very interesting set of problems. We also sort of talking about the cost of testing all of these things and some of the conflicts between, wanting to get to a world of IoT where you have very inexpensive, probably very small, very densely distributed devices, but then also, the ultra high reliability aspects of 5G, and some of the engineering challenges that are going to require quite a bit of cost. So, your thoughts on challenges?
I think the tolerances are just tighter now on frequency in the bands, and especially millimeter wave. Just the different substrates that are having to be used, all these different test technologies. I think what happened in 4G is there was a lot of conducted testing, a lot of radio resource management testing, a lot of testing in wires. Now with massive MIMO, you have 32, 64 element arrays that are just common in 60 gig devices now, that will be common in the 28 and 60 gig. So we have to move to this OTA type testing, but how do you do that in a quick manner for production tests? It's one thing to do it in the lab and do it for R&D. It's another thing for production testing. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges will be production testing. From the R&D side, the challenge right now is getting amplifiers. We saw some of the demos here where they looked great on MATLAB and they looked great in simulations. When they put it through an amplifier, there's maybe some issues with their amplifier at that range. Or they're addressing those issues, but it doesn't look like what they had predicted necessarily. So I think, but those are normal challenges that happen in the R&D process. So I think it's more on the production side where the biggest challenges will be.
Yeah, one of the things that Jeff Shamblin brought up was that, you have a 3x3 antenna, 3 millimeter by 3 millimeter antenna. If your manufacturing is off by even as little as 1/10 of a millimeter, that's a lot of...
Hundreds of megahertz
difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And hundreds of megahertz difference can mean regulatory issues, your out-of-band emissions, slow production test down. It can affect how accurate your measurements are and your frequency offsets. So that affects then all the use cases then for low latency, and now you're having to do more of these cyclic prefix and more retries to compensate for that in your amplifier. So I think it all feeds into the system level issue of we want this low latency, ultra reliable network. And I think one of the interesting things is we talked a lot about high throughput.
Yeah.
You mentioned the IoT side. Those are polar opposites.
Very different.
And so the cost models are different. I guess the thought process by some of the people on our panel was to use one common test for everything. I don't know that that's necessarily the solution that can be done for a high-end device versus a car versus an IoT embedded device. So it'll be interesting. I think the industry needs to standardize on the testing, but what that needs to be, there's a lot of ground to be plowed with regards to that.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, Emil.
Thank you.